Our speaker today is Matt Smith, EMEA Data Protection Pre-Sales Engineer at Quest. Matt has been part of Quest's Data Protection Pre-Sales team for the past 10 years, working with companies across verticals ranging from education, public sector, to technology, finance and transportation across EMEA. In his role, Matt has enabled service providers and customers to ensure that data protection, monitor and optimize environments, and to ensure the security of their last resort's restorations. Matt, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, it is 10 years. You can see what it does to you, turns you grey. So, thank you all for joining me this morning. Now, what I thought might be kind of interesting to talk about and really understand, let's be kind of candid. We're all interested in cybersecurity because it is obviously a hot topic now. But it's a pretty wide topic, right? Let's not pretend. And we are definitely not going to get into every single nook and cranny in 30 minutes. So we're going to go through a pretty broad appraisal. But what I thought was kind of interesting, and something I've taken from my years working within the backup recovery space, is we get an awful lot of knowledge and insight when we really look to how we can build and apply certainly the backup and recovery side of our cyber resilience. Now, of course, other aspects of a cyber resilience plan, again, come into this too. But certainly, as I say, when I think about the backup and recovery piece, we really get a huge amount of insight when we really drill down into what we need to do and how we're going to go about protecting and recovering our systems. And what becomes kind of interesting then is, well, what can we do with this? What can we take this information? How can we use it to inform other sides of the business? And that's what I thought would be kind of interesting to look at today. Don't all agree at once, but it's because really, I think it's, when we talk about this backup recovery piece, we're really going across silos. We're going to the full environment. So we're not necessarily just looking at one aspect. And as I say, this is something that can drive into other parts of what we're doing to help improve decision making and how we can go about doing our daily tasks. So if you want the TLDR version, we learn lots of stuff doing backup. What can we do with it? So let's kind of kick off then by just considering, what do we look at and what do we want to think about when we go through our resilience strategy? And this is, by necessity, an entirely incomplete list, right? Now, quite happy to argue about anything else you think should be on there. But again, don't have all day, so I thought we'd just take a few kind of key things. So what do we need to do? What do we want to consider? Well, when we look at how we're going to protect ourselves from threats, we're going to look at how we protect our perimeters. So we're going to look at things like firewall, antivirus solutions. Again, I told you, really quite quick overview, so no deep dive on that. But we're going to look at that side. We're going to look at how we can patch and ensure we have updates applied. So we're going to do asset tracking. We're going to understand what devices are on network. When it comes to auditing access, again, we're going to look at a bare minimum, who has permissions where, what data do we have, who owns it is going to come into this. We're going to consider as well, again, part of the patching, for example, where do we have vulnerabilities that we need to remediate? And of course, nearest and dearest to my heart as a backup engineer for all these years, we're going to consider how we adequately back up, protect, and have the ability to restore this data. So suddenly, we've gone from perimeter defense, what contents we have, who we have where, and how we're going to encapsulate it all in a protected system. That's a huge, huge amount of insight. And we're going to take all this. Now, if we were to dive into just the backup piece, because got to go with my favorites, sorry. Just think about what we really need to consider to build this backup and recovery strategy. We need to look at our data. What do we have? Again, sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Really? Think, easy. I've got databases. Got some cat videos. Who doesn't have that? But we need to start thinking, what is this data? Who owns it? So what do we need to, how do we need to protect it for these guys, for a start? How long should we keep it? Again, that's always an interesting discussion, ranging from forever, 3 months and see what happens. But realistically, we can't just say forever for everything, right? So we need to ask this question. Can we recreate it? I mean, is it recoverable? Is it the kind of thing we can? And I mean, yes, of course, I can back up and recover it, but how do we make it useful? And of course, relatively, is it important? Again, I have customers who do not back up 100% of the estate because it isn't all important. It's not really got any value, some of it. And that's fine. That's perfectly okay. But we have to go through this exercise. We need to consider, particularly when we come to restore, what's important. Because that's going to help us decide what's coming first. Because realistically, it's rare that we need everything at once. Now, I bet there's always someone, but realistically, we're able to build these different levels of availability. So again, understand that. And of course, if you go and ask every owner, it's a bit like the screen test. How important is your data? Oh, it's so important. The most important. The most important test you've ever seen. It's a print server. Now, in some cases, I grant you that's important. But realistically, not everything is that. And we're going to have to make a choice somewhere. Sometimes even with people maybe disagreeing. How long can we tolerate downtime? It's not something we like to talk about, but it's true. We have to have this question. How long can we tolerate it? Because we're going to balance all these things up for how we deal with this. So when we come to our recovery point objectives, recovery times, all of this feeds in. Especially if we're looking after important kind of PII, for example. We have requirements not only for how we keep it, in the sense that we need to keep it secure. Can you keep it? Because again, I need this all 7 years. But the contents of that data, are you allowed to keep it 7 years? And again, it's not always going to be as simple as yes. Sometimes there's different things to consider. And then when we get to our vital stuff, we need to really be sure, is it vital? Because generally speaking, this is where we're going to have the most aggressive recoveries, the most aggressive retentions. So if we're going to bring it back quick, that generally might have a slightly higher cost associated with it. So we need to be clear of this and make sure we know what it is. And then there's always the interesting one. Was it something like about 90% of data is probably accessed less than 10% of the time? And yes, like all statistics, that is 90% made up on the spot. In all seriousness though, we have a lot of this kind of static data. It's pretty common. So really, when someone's trying to tell you that, oh, I've just got this stuff and I just can't do without it. But do you? Do you? And again, sometimes the answer will be yes, and it's justifiable. But most companies have an awful lot of inertia when it comes to the data they've kept, understandably. I mean, no. Hands up who's got emails from when they first started their first day at their job. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure that onboarding email from when I was in a different company before we was taken over, I'm certain it's still relevant today, because I'm sure that HR manager's still with me and can still help. Anyway, but the point being, it's all about that understanding. And of course, we consider security. Again, parts that come tying back to things like these requirements. If it's crucial data, do I need to encrypt it? Do I have to make sure it's in keeping with frameworks? Where am I going to put it? Because again, key stuff, we're going to look for multiple copies, immutability. All these things are really crucial to this. And of course, we then consider, we want to put this all together and decide what functionality is going to be relevant here. And I'm sorry, this is the most animations I have. I promise everything else is a bit lighter. But I thought we'd get the fun out of the way first, right? Now, we then need to consider how we tie all of this into our functionality how we're going to use it. And again, going back to some of our other questions, how we're off-siting it, whether we do or don't use cloud. And again, the answer to that is maybe it depends on your needs. It's not a yes or no. But ultimately, skipping through here, we've got so many things we look at, right? So I think I've probably overstayed that point at this time, but just that backup piece, right? We have done such a thorough discussion, theoretically, an understanding of what we have and how we look after it. We've suddenly learned a huge amount, right? Like, we've suddenly discovered so much about all this data we have. But the big thing is, we've done this across everything, right? This is not a siloed approach. If we do it as a silo, we're going to forget, I don't know, half the stuff we have. We have to consider this holistically across everything we have. Otherwise, it's not going to be a full strategy. Now, yes, I know some places do work a little bit more isolated, and that, that's fine. But the principle is that across the estate for which we're responsible, these are the kind of questions we have to ask to drive a really thorough and strong backup piece of our overall cyber resilience. You'll be glad to hear I'm not going to do all this with asset tracking and database management. So let's roll it back and think. As I say, we've just discovered a huge amount about what we have and what we're doing. And we have this wonderful phrase, and I'm not going to pretend I coined it, but we have this idea of being data-driven. And all that means is we're taking quantifiable information to drive our decisions. So just going back to that last page, for example, I'm not asking someone for their gut feeling. Do you know that test database from 2013? What do you think? We want to understand the real value in order to make sure it's in the correct place within our backup requirements. Again, so I'm a backup guy, that's my main focus on these, but again, it may be you've got that lovely Windows 95 laptop. We're going to make sure it's patched, but is it important? And again, I'm not just looking for it's been holding up my bookshelf for 20 years, so can we keep it? We want more than just that. And this is where we use all this information to decide what we're going to do in the scope of our cyber resilience. And if we just take a few key pieces here, again, I've got 4 bits I've picked out. Data growth. Well, data growth is always an interesting one. It's not the easiest to predict, but we can use this information to help understand that, because we need to know it. If I want to back it up, i.e. copy it off somewhere, I still need to know what I've got and how much is more to be added. Data retention, how long do I need to keep it? Again, we don't want this blanket lazy, everything 7 years. That's just not really going to work for a proper strategy. Plus, going to be spending a lot on that one. Again, the assets, we know what we've got. We can't make decisions properly if we don't understand what we have. Again, sounds really simple, doesn't it? And of course, finally, a little bit of appetite for risk. Because there is, let's be frank, there's a balance we're going to strike. And sometimes it might be based on the effort to do everything. Sometimes it might be based on cost. But we're going to decide what can we cope with losing. And sooner or later, that has to be a discussion. So if we think about that, and again, we'll filter it through our backup lens. Not to say the other things aren't important, I promise you. Putting those little labels on all those laptops so you know whose is just as important. But there's really kind of 4 things that we see as the key challenge when you consider your backup piece. Again, I specifically picked these out from what we've seen before. Data growth, our compliance with retentions, how we're dealing with cybersecurity, and how we plan for DR. Because listen, nobody likes planning for DR, but it is a necessity, unfortunately. We have to talk about what's going to happen. So what do we kind of pick out here? Continuing the theme, what can we take here to give us this insight that we've learned? I'm not going to ask anyone to reveal their age by saying who recognises that. Okay, just saying you can guess for me. CITV when I was young. Now, take the first one. there is always more data than we realize. And when we do this thorough discovery, you'd be surprised how much stuff's hanging around. I mean, I say this, I joke about it. I've had a customer who asked me to build a solution for 5 terabytes. No bother. It's fine. We can do that. So we did that, built a solution, got it in place. It's working well. 7 months later, so that's great, it's great, it's going well. Listen. I know we put in some growth, but they've just found 20 terabytes extra. How can we work with that? It's just a mere 400% growth in 7 months. I mean, it's, what are you going to do? But I joke about it. But there is always more than we realize. And it's important to understand this, because particularly recently, we've come through an era where disk is relatively cheap, so people just kept stuff. And again, I'll use the term relative because it depends, of course, which kind of arrays, which storages we use. But generally speaking, disk was relatively cheap, so we just kept everything. So there's huge amounts of data there. But still, we should be asking the same question. What is this data? Because again, I'm not going to, so I won't ask them to put their hands up here, but who happily sends silly pictures to their colleagues across Teams or on emails? I hope my manager's not looking. Right? We all do. They get stored somewhere. Okay, it's probably in 365 these days. But does anyone remember the days of a 5 meg inbox and exchange? Yeah, been there. Yeah. When you're in tech support, you're sending a 2 meg batch file out to everyone. That's interesting what happens to Exchange around the office. Anyway, but the point is, we still need to kind of consider these parts in it because it's driving the growth and it's driving what we're working with. So again, things like tiering solutions, it's not new. I don't say that as a criticism. It's been around for a while. But again, is this data, well, one, is it important to back up? And it might be pretty low priority but necessary. It might not be important at all. But equally, that shiny, lovely all-flash array, how many terabytes do you want to spend on cat videos on there? And I'm okay if you say 20, that's fine. We've all got to have our threshold for silly videos. But the point is, data growth is quite often not linear, it's quite often lumpy, but there's also a lot of hidden surprises under the surface. If we consider retention, because this is pretty closely related, and honestly, that picture gave me hives. Oh, number of shortcuts on desktop. Although at least I have trained my parents now, being IT, so I'm the IT support. Now, exactly, we've all been there, we've all done. You work in IT? Well, I use a computer. Come and fix mine. Now, in all seriousness, we can relate to our data growth piece. Do we have policies? Do we have trimmings of emails? I tell you now, I love the fact that I don't ever have to archive anything off of my email anymore, because that was not fun every 3 to 4 weeks. Oh, you filled up your 10 meg, let's trim some out. It's great having 100 gig and never even worry about it again. But to be fair, the principle still applies. Is this stuff we need, and do we want to use primary storage on it? Do we want to use primary backups? And the answer might be no, and it's perfectly legitimate, bless you. This is where we need to start considering this knowledge we have, because with data growth, how much can we cope with retentions? Is this stuff worth keeping? Again, same principle. And ultimately, if we're keeping everything forever, are we keeping ourselves a ticking time bomb for PII? Again, if we assume the worst case happens and we do get attacked, and it's one of the exfiltration extortion cases, if we put in policies for the data we keep, would that have reduced our exposure because PII is being leaked? And again, the answer is, it really depends. Don't ask me for a definitive one-word answer, but it's all dependent on what you're doing with it. But we still need to ask that question. And of course, then we come to cybersecurity. See, it's all related, as above, so below. Obviously, we're looking at how we defend against the threats, and we need to consider these functionalities. And I'm sorry, it's not the last time I mentioned data growth, but I'll try to do it only one time this page. When we start talking about immutability, we are committing to keeping something. So do we want to commit to keep 20 years worth of funny GIFs Again, you're perfectly legitimate to say yes if it matters to you, but we need to be realistic here because there is a cost. Again, things like our backup schedules. What should be more? What should be less often? Do we copy data off-site? And as for air-gap copies, how do we implement that? We need to consider this too, because again, it's all back to what we talked about, that data management. Can we actually manage to do so? Patching, again, goes without, I say it goes without saying, but there's still people who don't. But I'd like to say it goes without saying. But patching is still a crucial technology. So we need to have that there, and again, the threat detection. But we can't do these things without this understanding we've already gained by looking through the environment thoroughly. And then, of course, coming back to disaster recovery. Again, that's still got to be part of it. And again, maybe all of your systems are tier 1, and that is not incorrect. It's relative to user needs. But maybe there's a tier 1, 2, 3. Now, that secret Minecraft server you have running, that VM that says do not touch. Listen, I don't judge. I don't judge anyone. You want to hide that in your tier 1 offsite? Feel free. But again, we need to consider this, because, joking aside, do we want 100% uptime? Again, that can be a legitimate answer, but you need one-to-one resource. Again, had that question before. I love the fact that I can do this real-time replication of your backups. Great, I says. Customer says, okay, it's my SQL servers. Now, they're not big. They're only about 2 terabytes. I says, okay, that's not too bad. That's not too bad for bandwidth, right? Sounds good, doesn't it? They say, but it must be 100% performance. So, okay, what's the config of them? 32 cores each and 126 gig RAM, 28, I can't count. Well, I says, that's fine. Can you give me a host that's got 64 cores, 256 gig that we can reserve for these VMs? And by the way, you need to put the backup server on there too. Comes a response. And again, that's not an incorrect position, but we need to recognize that you can't run on thin air. So it's the same principle. What's the relevance? What's the importance? What do we need it for? And it drives that decision. And then we might even decide that actually, maybe we'll do real-time replication instead of just backup replication. And that's fine. Nothing here is wrong to decide. But it all comes back to that initial point. If you don't understand what you have, you can't make that decision. And the same goes to where we put it off-site, whether that's Iron Mountain, whether that's Azure, whether it's Big Trev around the corner with an open stack in his garage. Well, those are perfectly legitimate decisions, or at least 2 or 3 are, and those are fine. But it's got to come back to that strategy you've defined to understand where it's right. So, I've talked about where we can use this data in reference to our cyber resilience piece, but it doesn't actually end there, because this insight is really valuable. And yeah, great, you can close the book there and say, look, I've got everything sorted, I've got my backups in place, I know what I'm replicating, my endpoints are patched, so I'm as cyber secure as I can be. Fine. But I think we can go further. I think we can build this in further out. So just to remind ourselves, I've said we're looking at all these things, I've said all these different things we might touch, but let's just consider for a second, what layers are we looking at? Compute and storage. We're looking at the network. And we're looking at applications and the data itself. Again, we are not just considering within this cyber resilience area, how much network traffic do I have and do I need a bigger pipe? Again, these are all interesting things, but we have to think about all of these, particularly, say, from the backup piece. And this is what I've always thought is kind of interesting about doing the backup part. I touch all of this. I'm not siloed into just one of these. I touch everything. So this is why I say it's kind of interesting, because it really helps us when we start to pivot to becoming data-driven and start to help apply robust data governance. Because on a really basic, and I have made it as clear and simple as I thought I could, we know everything. We know who, what, where, when, what we have, who the user is, where it is, when they're doing things. All this data is going to come with that cyber resilience piece. Now, to be fair, things like the when, that's maybe from user auditing and kind of early alerting systems, excuse me. So yeah, okay, it's not backup, I agree. But the point is, it's a really big view of what's happening. So we can really understand who needs access to what, who uses what. And that means we can have more accurate planning and forecasting. Now, sorry guys, it's not the most exciting piece, but when it comes to budgets, if we have a clear idea of what we're going to be having, what we need and when, it makes it a hell of a lot easier. And we're not going from, that sand's about 5% before finishing, we must get a shelf in the next 2 weeks or else. Unless you want to do like some of my customers where they buy a sand, leave it in the box and nobody knows why. That's a serious story. That has happened, I've heard that. And again, I can't say that you're never going to need to grow or change. But if you've got that view and you know how and when, it makes it a lot easier to keep it in line when you need it. And similarly, if something's gone wrong, is anyone a DBA before I upset anyone? Right. Quite often DBAs like to be the master of their own domain. And that's fine, they're specialists in database. But a lot of them really couldn't care less about what's underpinning it. They don't know if it's a VM. They've heard there's this thing called Hyper-V or something, and maybe that's where the system's running. Well, all I can see is my transactions are slow, go and sort it. When we know this full relationship, we can use this knowledge to go and help understand what the problem is. And when we have this full understanding where things are, and again, I'm grossly simplifying this, I'm well aware, like really simplifying it. Maybe it's as simple as we've got a failed port on the SAN, but these guys quite often don't care. This is an infrastructure thing, I'm not interested. Okay, that's fine. You're a specialist in your own world, that's okay. But this is where having this big picture helps, because we know where to look. And it just means it simplifies a lot of our management. And that means when we turn it around and consider the virtuous circle, well, we become data-driven, and I've kind of already stepped on a toe here. If we're only looking at one silo, we don't have that complete relationship view. If we're only focusing on newer things, and that's fine, we're looking at delivering, but not really looking back at where we are and where we come from, it maybe means there are things we miss. And of course, it's worth mentioning, the longer we leave this kind of understanding, it makes it harder and harder. It makes it harder to gain this information as we build layers and layers up. So it makes it more and more difficult to get this insight and become data-driven. I'm not going to go through the animations again, you're glad to hear. But just to quickly remind ourselves, just think how many things we talked about that we look at from a backup perspective alone. Like, that's a lot. And don't get me wrong, always it's a lot when you start somewhere, and you have to start. But the longer you leave it, the harder this becomes. And of course, when we consider then what we've done, again, in terms of our cyber resilience, we've identified assets, we've addressed our vulnerabilities, we have the robust backup. We need to protect ourselves from this moment. And, let's be candid, it may still happen. But the point is that everything we've done before we get attacked leads to this overview. So this is kind of really key to think what we can do here. And if I were more data-driven, I would have kept a closer eye on the time, but just to refresh ourselves then, what are we doing? By becoming data-driven, we implement this data governance across everything. It's a top-down implementation. And it makes it easier to do it going forward. But it means as well we can start to worry less about the day-to-day because we know what we've had. If we understand what's here and we have that clean idea, it's so much easier to make these other steps happen. And again, I've grossly simplified a lot of it in this half hour because there's a lot to mention. But there's so many things we touch that can give us such valuable insight. Because again, I'll tell you now, next week when I'm talking to customers, probably about 90% of them will know about 70% of their environment. The other 10% will say to me they don't even know how many terabytes they need to back up. And it's not a criticism. Well, it's a little bit of a gentle nudging. But the point is that they can't make these decisions because they don't know what's there. When we do this and we go through these strategies, it gives us such a rich idea of what we have that we can implement these other strategies to improve what we're doing. So very quickly, we touch everything and it brings us that insight. It means we're no longer looking at a single silo view of the world. Doesn't mean we're not going to have siloed experts, and that's okay. I'm not trying to say that everyone knows everything. But having a point where we do this means we have a much more holistic view. And fundamentally, it puts this data governance perspective right at the heart of what we're doing. And when you have these concepts in the center of what you're doing, it makes it a lot easier then to start building outwards, to implement things like data quality in terms of what you have. And I'm only 1 minute over, so there we go, that was all right. But thank you all for that. I hope it was of interest.
We have some time for some Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for Matt? Stunned.
Go on. We've got a nice big pink mic, I like this.
Well, just a simple one really. The insurers put a lot of stock on business impact assessment, disaster recovery plans, business continuity policies. You know, how much stock do you actually put on the actual documentation around this?
Is it the insurer's documentation or the applicant's documentation?
The insurers insist on it all, and I think it's a bit of a waste of time, in all honesty.
Yeah. I think, now, not being an insurer, I have to lay the claim. Obviously, if you don't tell them, they don't know, but also that gives them the wiggle room. So I would turn around and say, we need to make sure they're satisfied with what we're doing. But I think it comes back to this kind of key point that you can't even start making that decision, start explaining this when there's stuff we don't know about. Again, I know this is a grossly simple point when I say it, but it really is fascinating how often I can be in a conversation with customers, and like I said, it's not about criticising people, honestly. I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm dragging people down, because you cannot do these things if you don't know what you have, or at least if you only know about 60% of it, you can only protect 60%. So coming back to that side, you know, it might be, if you have this kind of flawed understanding, you tick the boxes for part with insurance, which then comes back to the risk side. And again, you're putting a certain amount of risk into that. Now, to a point, you may say, look, we just don't have the time to do this, and we accept that risk, because again, there's always an element of that. So probably coming right back to this. I mean, with what the insurers are saying, some of it is pretty sensible anyway, right? It's not anything totally different to what we've done backup-wise for the past 30 years. And, you know, grossly simplified, can you back it up? Can you restore it? And do you have a spare copy? None of that is radical. But although it's a good place to kind of start looking, because it means you're within the framework of what they're looking at. And certainly, particularly if in legislative, in certain areas, it's kind of key. But what I will say is they are approaching a very almost high-level generic approach to it. It's got to be ticked off here. So there's probably wiggle room for how it's implemented. The problem is we've always got to bear in mind that if we need to use this, we want to be compliant with what they want. So basically it's a yes and no and a maybe all in one. But
yeah, I just don't, whenever we have an incident, nobody reaches for the disaster recovery plan, I think is my point.
Yeah, exactly.
We tend to not know what we've lost. That seems to be the main concern. Yep. But what I am seeing is a bit of a virtuous circle now where cloud costs are so extortionate that the executive are starting to pay attention to what's in the cloud. Therefore, how do we drive down the cost? Therefore, can we be more efficient with our record keeping?
Absolutely. I mean, the cloud's a perfect example because it's so easy. I mean, I doubt anyone's shocked when I talk about virtual machines sprawled on premise, right? And I can tell you now, the amount of times I've seen note, delete in September 2015. Guys, it's 2023. You know, it's still there. And the cloud is in some ways even worse because it's so easy. So like that one, again, coming back to where I say, if you don't know what you have, you can't work with it. And particularly, this is where you say, they're not invoking the disaster recovery because they don't know what they've done. So they don't know how to invoke disaster recovery in the first place. And of course, whether it was even covered in the DR plan, nobody knows. And this is where, and like I says, I'm not going to say it's easy. You know, unfortunately, it's not. There are tools to help, but I mean, I'm not going to present this as, oh, it's so easy, just spend 5 minutes and you'll know. But it is a little bit of doing that homework enables that next stage. But the other part, and I didn't really go into planning because again, it's just not enough time. But like your DR planning, again, perhaps we have planning with different sort of concerns. You know, minor data loss that we would like back is not the same as panic stations because, you know, it's been, for whatever reason, the volcano in the middle of Edinburgh has decided to kick out. You know, these are different scenarios, and of course we should be, maybe we don't necessarily have that detailed run book for, I'm kind of annoyed because I've lost my Word document, now I've got to start again. It is very different. But that's also where that planning phase comes back, and that's informed by the first bit. So again, it's the virtuous circle of once we have a handle on what we have, we can make sure it's adequately in the cycle, and of course then the response is proportional to it, rather than panic stations. So yeah, sorry, it's a big, long maybe answer.
No problem, you can have your alarmingly pink.
Anybody else want to use the alarmingly pink microphone?
So you don't have to talk to me in public, it's okay. I won't tell anyone.
Okay. Matt, do you have a stall or are you staying for the rest of the day?
I will be here for the rest of the day, and if I remember correctly, it's F1. There's about a 50% chance I'm right with that. But I'm right in, if go in there, turn right at the end, and now the niche references, we're bright orange, so you know, just imagine you've got someone with a marching drum, you'll know where to find us. I possibly shouldn't have said that. No, you'll find us, we are amusingly orange, so you can't miss us. And as I promised, you don't even have to talk to me, you can talk to everyone else, it's okay. I won't take it personally.
Right. Thanks again, Matt.
Thank you.